This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Daniel O'Brien, K-State grain economist, begins the show with a grain market outlook where he explains why the futures and cash markets have fallen off. A discussion on Sericea Lespedeza and its control options with K-State rangeland management specialist Molly Reichenborn and K-State extension agronomist Tina Sullivan continues today's show. K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond ends the show as he recaps the recent impressive rains and what temperatures he is expecting with the forecasted humidity. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update from K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. Daniel, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby.
Daniel, as we're looking at the grain market, what trends are we currently seeing, specifically as we look at futures?
Strong falling off of futures prices here. We closed these 26 corn futures at the harvest number down to 451.5. And as you and I have talked about expected price levels for new crop futures over the years, generally when you're pretty much not that terribly worried, but yet there's still some time, i.e. time value before we get there, you're at about 450. And that's about where we're at for D's corn. The November futures for soybeans down to 1141 at times. That's certainly been lower than where it's at. And July, Kansas City hard red winter wheat at 620.5. That's higher than it had been not that long ago. There's some underlying fundamentals impacting all that. I think the biggest story would be the fall off in July corn futures. Closed yesterday down to 423 3/4, and we try to follow some technical indicators to give us an idea of I guess where current price trends are relative to historic numbers and whether they're likely to continue or not. And here we have July 26 corn has a relative strength indices down to basically 31, which is 50 is neutral. If you get to 70 or 80, you're strongly bullish. Wasn't that about 2-3 weeks ago? We were pretty bullish, quite bullish for corn. Here we've fallen off. I don't doubt that part of that is the psychology of the market, that where if we we have been getting in recent years too, through May, if there's no problem getting the crop in, which we really haven't had that so far this year, seems to be adequate moisture, no immediate drought on the horizon. If there are problems overseas, we're not really worried about them yet, i.e. particularly South America. So without anything happening, we get into the mode where we price the risk out of the market. And when July corn had been about just under 490 within the last couple of weeks, now down to 424. So the market is not indicating, not pricing in any riskiness that would give us anything other than a large crop, low price situation once we get out into fall. And my own thought is it's probably premature to be that way, in that it's only June the 4th, the 5th, something like that, and we have all of July, all of August to get through. For corn, we have pollination, tasseling pollination, all sorts of things happening in latter July and on into early August, depending how early the corn develops. For soybeans, we also have planting to still occur, and also all the key reproductive phases that happen for soybeans that happen in August. So here we've fallen off quite a bit, and displaying an awful lot of volatility in the markets. So the market is driven by what it sees as key factors. At this time, no production risk and issues, and we still have the geopolitical issues coming in for both corn and for soybeans. You can broaden that to feed grains and oil seeds that have to be worked through, and so far none of those have caused enough worry in the market to take us take us higher. It'll be interesting to see what happens in coming days. Will they maintain these low trends? Again, a really hard downward trend for corn, hard downward trend, almost as extreme down to 34 RSI, relative strength indices for soybeans. So both a strong downtrend, and we'll see. So you could kind of categorize your thoughts as with along the lines of here to June 4th. What will it be on July 4th? What will it be on August 4th? Because we've got a lot of factors to work through by the time we get there. We might ultimately end up at these low prices for new crop futures, but I wouldn't just sign it in without acknowledging the riskiness and uncertainty we have to deal with before we get there. I should also mention for wheat futures. We talked before about how July wheat closed at $6.20. The downward trend for wheat is just as pronounced. Had been up to $7.50 about 2 weeks ago for the July 26 hard red wheat contract closed at $6.20 and a quarter for July here. Thought provoking for sure. And again, relative strength indices also heading downward, down to 35% for the wheat contract as well. In looking at underlying fundamentals for corn, and then maybe it's corn and sorghum, maybe it's because of low prices, partly. Pretty strong export weeks, really, for the week ending. For the last numbers we have for corn, for the week ending May the 28th, had about just under 68 million bushels shipped, and that's pretty much on pace, a little bit low, by about 1 million of what the USDA has projected. It's record high, 3.3 billion bushels shipped. So that's still going along. Sorghum had a pretty good week, 7.2 million bushels shipped, and need a pace of about 5 to meet the USDA's projection. So that's helpful, no doubt. China is still quite involved in that. For soybeans, had a just under 21 million bushels shipped. We need about 18 and a half beat the USDA's projection for this marketing year of 1.530 billion bushels, and that's with about 12 weeks left in the marketing year. So all these have been doing pretty well. Wheat doing decently here. You're coming up to the end of those marketing years here on, well, the end of the marketing year has happened, and the final USDA numbers will come out next week, and that will, in terms of the USDA's weekly foreign ag service export numbers, and those will indicate that we'll have to have adjusted, very likely have to have adjusted the wheat export numbers down a few million bushels, and all that leads into the next. What the market considers to be hard numbers, but they're still in flux. The next WASDE report, I believe that's on June the 11th. Here we're I guess we're in the time frame whereas the market searches around for where to go, it takes in crop report numbers. It looks at USDA, WASDE reports. NASS will be coming out with a new acreage report at the end of the end of the month, and I think that we'll probably see lower corn acres as 1.25 million to about 1.5 million acres. Again, that the numbers that we had in that March report were pretty much thought to be low by most market observers. Again, the fertilizer issues coming into play, fertilizer cost issues, all impacting that. So you're probably going to see sometime in the next 30 days, by the time you get the WASDE reports and the acreage report for in June, and then the early July WASDE report, you probably see some pretty significant shifts around in both the corn and the soybean balance sheets. And what probably happens is have lower corn acres, so tighten up stock some. So that's going to be interesting to look at, and what market impact that could have, especially if we don't get astoundingly high corn yields. And for soybeans, probably somewhat higher soybean acres. But again, the USDA is plugging in record high soybean yields as well, and at 53 bushels per acre national average. And that's certainly attainable, but not very often attainable. So we have a whole lot of production uncertainty, some hard adjustments that will be happening in acreage for major crops, and then seeing where we go with regard to the to exports and all sorts of geopolitical issues at hand as well.
As you noted, futures looking like they've fallen off a little bit. Do you see that happening anywhere else in the grain market?
Well, certainly, cash markets and basis levels have pretty much moved in step, but not completely. It's noteworthy to me to look at what's happened to prices of for corn at ethanol plants in the last over the last 2 or 3 weeks. There was a time not that long ago when Illinois, Indiana had 30, 40, 50 cents per bushel higher prices than we had it here in Kansas. And now, but the latest reports came out yesterday on June the 4th. The average corn price Illinois at the plants is $4.35. In Kansas, 4.34 and a half, and that's a strong change from where we've been. Again, the Eastern Corn Belt production situation, at least as farmers and ethanol plant merchandisers look at those their situations in their local regions. There's less worry at this point in the Eastern Corn Belt around ethanol plants in terms of securing supply to the place where they've come down and are basically matching where we're at. So early June and basically almost all of a growing season in front of us. It does look like the futures here of late have taken the attitude that there's no production risk or minimal production risk to worry about. So we're dropping down sharply and on the futures. It seems premature from a market observer's point of view, but particularly with all that can happen on the weather side. But really, we're kind of in the show me attitude. Yes, there's production risk out there, but the market are not inclined to still maintain much of that in their pricing structure until they actually start to see it.
Daniel, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Thank you very much, Shelby.
That was K-State grain economist Daniel O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show with reminders about Sericea Lespedeza from K-State Extension Rangeland Management Specialist Molly Reichenborn and K-State Extension agronomist Tina Sullivan. Molly, Tina, thank you both so much for taking the time to join us today.
Thanks for having us, Shelby.
We commonly every year talk about Sericea Lespedeza, but Molly, can you share with us reminders about what is it?
So Sericea is an introduced noxious weed species that we have in Kansas. It's really primarily an issue in the eastern part of the state, but it is documented in the central part of the state and moving that direction. So it's kind of we call it like a shrubby looking plant. As it gets older, it gets kind of, it gets woody growth. It starts kind of as a single stem and it gets branchier and woodier as it gets older. It has something called trifoliate leaves, which means if you pick a leaf, you'll see 3 leaflets spread that make the entire part of the leaf, which is pretty distinct. However, there's some native species that look kind of similar. They're in the same genus as Sericea. So one of the things I always like to mention when we talk about Sericea is to hold the leaves up to the light. If you look at the leaf veins, you'll see they're parallel to each other versus if you're looking at a native Lespedeza species. So if you're not sure, that's always a good way to tell them apart. As Sericea gets older, it gets pretty distinct. But if you have like a new population or a new plant coming up, it can be kind of hard to tell.
Why is this a problem?
The reason that we're so concerned about it is because it displaces native species that we're concerned with, or other species that we're cultivating for production, like I say, in tame pasture stands as well. So they're crowding out other species that we want to have on the landscape. And the downside is it's not really readily eaten by cattle. It actually has a decently high crude protein content, but it also has, especially as it ages, it gets a high percentage of a secondary compound known as condensed tannins. It makes the taste really bitter. Cattle can't really process this very well. So even though it has a decently high crude protein, they don't graze it readily because of this secondary compounds that are in the Sericea plant. Small ruminant grazers will graze them, though. I won't get too ahead of myself, but mostly it's a problem because it's crowding out forage species that we want. And especially since most folks are running cattle in Kansas, if cattle won't readily eat it, it creates this kind of feedback loop where you have a plant that does really well. It's not being having much grazing pressure on it, especially if you're just running cattle. And so it kind of creates this feedback loop that makes it more and more abundant on the landscape.
Is it commonly found in livestock pastures then?
Yeah, it's not uncommon, unfortunately, which is a really common problem we have with noxious weeds that are introduced. It was really brought in not for forage species, but was repurposed for that later on, thinking that it would be a good forage species because it does have a high crude protein content, but at the time didn't realize that the condensed standards were such a problem. So it was actually intentionally put into range seed, including CRP programs. So folks were encouraged initially to include it in seed mixes, and then it got established. It really did very well and wasn't being grazed, and now we have the problem that we have now.
Thinking about control for this, then, what is one option producers or people might just want to consider?
When it comes to management options for Sericea Lespedeza, we have a number of options, and some of these options actually need to be used in tandem together, more than one option trying to control those populations. And as it is a noxious weed in the state, we must control it. This is not a just let it be. This is we need to control it, especially when we think about livestock production. If the cattle are not grazing it, we're just going to continue to let it grow and take over a pasture or a field if we're not managing it. So combinations of prescribed burning, grazing, mowing, and or herbicide applications are really what's used for this long-term management of Sericea. If you have Sericea just kind of coming into a field, you might not need all the options or, go in with a quote nuclear method. But if you have kind of a long-standing population, it's going to take not just, one of these options, it's probably a combination of these options and potentially annual, treatment, not just a every couple of year kind of treatment.
What are the herbicide options?
So some of our most effective herbicides for treating Sericea lespedeza when it's in its vegetative mode, so before it's tried to flower, are going to be like Remedy or Pasture Guard HL. When we do broadcast applications of Remedy Ultra at 1 to 2 pints per acre, and then Pasture Guard HL at 0.5 to a pint and a half per acre, sprayed at 10 to 20 gallons per acre, it will help with that control. So it is a kind of a herbicide option where we need to use more volume in an area for more coverage. There are a couple other options like Surmount, but Surmount is a restricted use herbicide, so just kind of be mindful of that one. Even though as restricted, we can also use it for some other hard to control weeds like roughleaf dogwood or blackberries.
You mentioned needing to use control options in tandem. And so another option, prescribed burning. And how might a producer use this within their system?
So prescribed burning can be effective for management in a lot of different ways, and it can be with Sericea too. But the caveat is, so Sericea is a hard-seeded species. And it's also the seed production is also a big problem with Sericea, why it is such a problem, because it produces a lot of seed. Once it gets mature, and those seeds tend to last in the seed bank for a very long time, maybe decades. So even if we treat above ground, you're going to have that seed bank persist for a really long time, which makes it, again, one of the reasons that makes it so difficult. So I should caveat by saying this: if fire is hot enough for long enough, fire can actually kill Sericea seed. The problem is prescribed fire is not hot enough, and not for long enough. So in fact, it has this kind of counterintuitive effect where it scarifies the seed, meaning it damages the seed coating, and that actually can stimulate germination. And that's what we see with Sericea. So this is especially true, like say in the spring, when this is during a time where we think that fire itself would damage like established adult plants that are above ground. You can have a huge flush from the seed bank after you do a fire. The upside is if you apply herbicide right after that, maybe say about 6 weeks. So they're actively growing, which is generally a good time when we want to apply herbicide. You can actually basically get a flush out of the seed bank. So get that seed out of that seed bank that's going to continue haunting your property and basically kill those plants. So that's the upside. So if you combine prescribed fire with herbicide, it can actually be effective. Just don't do only that. And that's true because folks have asked me about, like, say, like summer burns and fall burns to try to target Sericea when it's a more vulnerable time, basically when we expect that the carbohydrate reserves are at their lowest around flowering. So you can do that. But again, I would say follow up, like if there's enough time and you see growth after that burn, even later on in the season where you see new germination and growth, go ahead and hit it again about 6 weeks after the fact. If your burn is late enough where you're not seeing a whole lot of growth before we go into dormancy, then still make sure that you follow up with herbicide either that spring or the following fall. So like if it's in the spring where you have, say, really active new growth, using something like Remedy or Pasture Guard, like Tina mentioned. But once you get past, say, when you're getting to the point of flowering, later growth stages, going into the summer and fall, then you switch usually to something that has a longer residual time like Escort.
Molly, what about mowing for control?
So mowing can be something that you can do primarily to like avoid seed set. So I say you don't get a chance to apply herbicide or you don't have the option or some other control method that you don't have in your toolkit. And something like say if you're dealing with a relatively small acreage, and you're just like, I can mow this, you can. And this is especially helpful if, say, you're getting towards the end of the season, like Sericea is flowering, and you want to avoid having seed set and adding more seeds to the seed bank, you can mow. That's also something you do with prescribed burning to do the same goal, which is to avoid that seed set later on in the season. The one caveat I would say with mowing is if you cut down these plants, they will then tend to grow low to the ground, which in itself is not a problem. But then those individuals get harder to find in following years. So if you have grasses that are growing up around it that are taller than that, just keep in mind that it will be harder to find them and probably also to treat them because you're going to have more tall foliage around it. So it is an option. Just make sure you keep that in mind.
How long can it truly take to get this under control in a pasture?
Years, if ever. I wish I had a different answer for you, but I'm sure if you don't have Sericea on your property and you've asked anyone who's had it on their property or managed it on their property, they probably would tell you never, or I will like continue battling this plant until the next person takes over the property, frankly. That being said, though, we do have tools in our toolkit to be really effective in reducing Sericea. And I think historically we've kind of just assumed that we'll apply herbicide every few years and that'll be sufficient. I don't really think that's true anymore. We really need to have, kind of like Tina mentioned, is to thinking about this every year. If you have the means to do something, even if it's herbicide application or doing like a late season burn or doing goat grazing, something like that to knock the plant back, it may not kill them, but at least knock them back. Continually pull off their reserves and do something to set them back every year, every other year. I think that's the only real approach that you have a chance of significantly reducing this. Or monitoring your property and catching populations early before they become a huge problem. Again, as I think anyone who has dealt with the species will tell you, if you can catch it early, which is hard and rare, you will do yourself a huge favor in time and cost in trying to manage this.
Molly, Tina, I appreciate both taking the time to join us today.
Thanks, Shelby.
Thanks, Shelby.
That was K-State Rangeland Management Specialist Molly Reichenborn and K-State Extension Agronomist Tina Sullivan. In today's show notes on agtoday.net, I will link an article that has more information on this topic. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with a weather update from K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Chip, what impressive rainfalls have we seen in this past week?
I'll tell you what, when we look at some areas of the state, especially the Southwest to North Central, when they've received about a quarter of their annual rainfall in about a 7-day period, it's a lot of much needed rain for folks, and really, really glad that it worked out that way. You know, when we look at the actual amounts, they vary greatly. It's that time of the year where it just depends on where you're at. But for the last 7 days, we're recording this on Thursday, so you got to keep in mind it didn't include Thursday into Friday. Anywhere from 3 to 4 inches across most of Flint Hills, and across north central Kansas, upwards of almost 6 inches of rain, localized 7 inches of rain over the last 7 days. We get down into south central and southwest Kansas, we're looking at anywhere from 2 to 3 inches of rain, and far southwest, about 1 to 2 inches. And really, it'd probably be easier to talk about the folks that didn't get as much. Along the Colorado border around Tribune, they only got about 3/4 of an inch. There's another little area, and an area I'm watching with interest in southeast Kansas, Cherokee County and Labette County. Those areas didn't quite get as much rainfall, only about 0.3 to an inch in those areas. And when we think about average precipitation for the time of year, Southeast should be getting the most with about weekly average of about 1.7 inches. Whereas you get further west, they average a lot less. But when we look at in terms of the drought monitor, we really needed rainfall in the west. We had some pretty drastic improvements in the drought monitor this week we cut down the extreme drought from about 13% of the state down to about 4%. That included improvements in central Kansas and southwest and northwest Kansas. We shrunk down the abnormally dry. We're down to about 65% of the state now with abnormally dry conditions or worse. So definitely drought improvements. When we look at the crops, warm season crops that are in the ground, I know some folks are still putting some warm season crops in the ground. They won't be doing that for a little bit. And I know some other folks are trying to get wheat harvest done, or terminate their wheat because of the recent dry conditions. And unfortunately, muddy conditions are a result of all this widespread rainfall.
As we look ahead, what can we be expecting when it comes to temperatures and potentially some more precipitation?
Yeah, well, first you got to think about the input of this precipitation. It had a lot of soil moisture, and so we've got just a lot of ambient moisture in the air that's going to lead to really high humidity. So when we see temperatures just bumping into the mid to upper 80s this week, it is muggy and gnarly. As you get into next week, temperatures are expected to increase even further. We're going to see temperatures getting into the mid to maybe even upper 90s in places. And so with that much ambient moisture and humidity, it's going to be really, really hot. We talked about this last week a little bit. Definitely time for producers to think about being proactive with livestock and people too. We're not quite adjusted to it, this high of temperatures and humidity. So that's going to be an issue next week. Precipitation chances, we're going to see them continue for central and eastern Kansas. Definitely a little bit of an eastward shift in precipitation as you go into next week, maybe not as much in the west as they finally start to dry out a little bit. It will really be interesting to see how the long-term forecast evolves. Right now, it's saying another basically shot of moisture is going to get pushed south into Texas and then back up north along the Rocky Mountains and then eastward to get into the plains by potentially next weekend, which is very similar pattern to what we've seen here over the course of the last week or so. So honestly, we're going to have a brief drier period. I think moisture is going to be more prevalent than not as we go into mid to late June. But then I think by the time we start getting late June into early July, I think things will start to dry out and we're going to start to deal with a lot more summer heat, at least briefly, probably before we get wet again by late summer, early fall. So I think overall the drought conversation, especially for western and central Kansas, has definitely decreased and is drastically improved and will continue to improve. Whereas we need to shift our focus more towards eastern Kansas, far southeast, where we could definitely see some drier conditions start to evolve as you go through the month of June.
Chip, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yep, thanks for having me.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.